There are two ways of doing psychology, so to speak. We can assume that the interior world is an extension or continuation of the exterior world and carry on in that way, which is the way that we do psychology. Or we can take the radical step of saying that the interior world is not a continuation. It's a world of its own. There is a difference of kind. There's a total discontinuity between the two. So what we're saying in this case is that the interior world is a rabbit hole. Standard psychology says the interior world is not a rabbit hole. It doesn't lead us anywhere weird where the rules are reversed or anything like that. It's just normal. We can get to know it the same as we can get to know anything. It's just the same as everything else, maybe more complicated, but that's all. And this viewpoint definitely rules the roost, because to us it sounds scientific, though just because it sounds scientific doesn't mean that it is. It presents itself as being scientific. Now, anyone who's a poet or an artist of any sort, or a visionary, anyone who actually has an inner life, what they call an inner life, is going to realize that the interior world does realize that the interior world is a rabbit hole. Of course it's a rabbit hole. When we go exploring it, it's a rabbit hole. We find out it's a rabbit hole. We fall down it. Anybody who has ever sincerely explored the interior world has fallen down a rabbit hole. So when we look at the writings of the mystics, we know that they're not treating the inner world as if it is a mere continuation of the outer world. And we can see that, but then we say, well, those guys aren't scientific. Which is true, I guess. But the problem is that scientific doesn't really work when you go down a rabbit hole. Scientific isn't. There are areas in which scientific doesn't work. And if we were to say they aren't, that would be unscientific in itself. Because science has become, in the last 100 years or so, aware of its own limitations, aware of what it doesn't know and can't know. So doesn't know and can't know is a big thing, a big difference from just doesn't know. Can't know is can't know. And in physics, this is a commonplace principle. All we have to do is think about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Just to give an example that's been knocking around for maybe 100 years or so, I'm not sure how long time. So what Heisenberg was saying is that if you have, for example, a particle, an object like a neutron going through space, we can obtain information about where the particle is going, but only at the price of not knowing where it is location-wise. Or we can obtain information about where it is, but only at the price of not knowing anything about where it's going. And this is a deep principle. This whole idea that we take for granted that we can exhaustively know everything about some element in reality is completely misguided, completely wrong. And because science, and in this case physics, is interested in finding out the truth about things, it hasn't recoiled from discovering this truth, which is the truth regarding the limits of what we can know. This might sound like a disaster to us because we want to know everything, or know both things. We want to know where the particle's going and how fast it's going there, because we imagine this will be to our advantage, which in the end it wouldn't be. But it isn't a disaster. It's actually a taste of an understanding, a comprehension, which would be amazing for us if we could get it. And we can get it if we persevere looking in that direction. Richard Feynman, who is definitely reputed to be one of the top physicists, if not the top physicists of the last century, possibly eclipsing even Einstein, who found it hard to catch up with him at times, pointed out that there is something circular in our way of understanding the basic forces, or the basic elements that we recognize in physics. We can talk, for example, about the gravitational force, and then maybe we can understand that in terms of some other force, and then we think we've explained it. But then that other force needs to be explained in terms of some other force, and in the end we find that nothing has been explained, because all explanations go round in a loop. So that's not a very good way of saying what Richard Feynman said, but that's basically what he is saying. He's saying that knowledge feeds on itself, and because it feeds on itself, it's ultimately redundant. So that's another example of limitology. We could throw our hands in despair, but we can't ever know anything because we wanted to know everything. Or we could realize that not knowing stuff is so much more exciting and alive a situation than knowing it, because when we want to know everything, we really want to kill it. Which is what E.F. Schumacher said when he was saying, well, aren't maps boring? Because you look at an old map and it's full of all these stuff that we know. We know that, we know that, we know that. We know there's a church there, we know there's a park there, we know there's Central Avenue over there. It's boring. We want to... He said, what about the stuff we don't know? The stuff that we haven't discovered? That's the really interesting stuff. So he's looking at it in a totally different way, of course. So a short while ago, I was saying that it's not scientific to think that science has applicability across the board in all realms of the universe. It's not scientific to think that. It's just dumb to think that. And we can conceptualize reality or the universe as being this kind of egg. So in the middle of the egg is the world we can know, the world of facts and figures, where we can compare things and derive ratios, and where the ratio making mind can happily do its thing and create information, data, and say that it knows things, which is all very reassuring. But then that's the middle of the egg. But the egg's got a top and a bottom. And the bottom, as we already know, once you get below a certain level, we start discovering that the framework of space and time starts disintegrating, and we can no longer treat objects as if they are objects, rather than being things that look like objects when we look at them in a certain way. So on the very, very small level, we definitely do find that we've gone down a rabbit hole. And no one's going to disagree with that at this stage. There's a rabbit hole, the rabbit hole of the very, very small. And we know about that. The top end of the egg is the very, very big, the kind of the biggest you can possibly get, which is the whole of everything. Just scoop it all together and put it together, because it is together anyway. Any boundaries that might exist between different parts of the universe are only in our heads. No one's ever found an actual hard boundary that absolutely separates one bunch of stuff from another bunch of stuff. No one's ever found that. No one's ever discovered it. It's never been located, written up in a scientific journal, because there's no such thing. It helps us to make sense of the world, is to say, well, that's one of those things and this is one of those things. It helps us to make sense of the world, but ultimately we only do that in accordance with our own arbitrary criteria, which we're applying for some reason or other. When you take the whole of everything, what you get is the whole of everything. And how can you be scientific about that? Because you can't say anything about it. You can't make any statements about it. We can only make statements when we can get out of whatever it is we're talking about and compare what we're talking about to some framework, comparing one thing to another thing. So that in order to know, we have to compare one thing to another thing, or a thing to our framework. It's all about comparisons. And then that creates a whole world, the world of known data, facts and figures. When you've only got the one thing, and only, I shouldn't say only because it's not an only, but when you've got the one thing, then clearly there's nothing to compare it with. So there's no way of generating positive data. There's no way of getting knowledge about it. There really isn't, because there's no comparison. And we say that quite lightly, oh, there's no comparison. There really isn't. But in this case, there really isn't. And because you can't compare the whole of everything with anything, you can't say anything about the whole of anything. You really, really cannot make statements about it, think about it, say anything intelligent about it at all. Every now and again people do have experiences of the whole of everything. It's a well-known thing that happens to human beings. It's the unitive experience. It's the experience of oneness. And then quite often if we have that experience, we run around blabbering, trying to tell people about it, and then we're kind of making fools of ourselves trying to talk about it and explain it to people, and people are just staring at us because we can't talk about it. There's no way of talking about it unless you happen to be a poet, and you can allude to it in a poetical or metaphorical way, and that's what the mystics do. And as long as we're able to enter into the spirit of metaphor and illusion, not allusion, then we can appreciate what the mystics are saying. Of course, most of us aren't really happy in the land of metaphor. We want to nail everything down in facts, and if we want to do that, then we'll never know what the whole of everything is, which is a meaningless question because it isn't anything. It is kind of an attempt to place it within a framework and say this is this and this is that, but the word is itself becomes profoundly meaningless without a framework. So because we can't nail down the whole of everything, rather ridiculously, we say there isn't such a thing, and we just pretend everything's just parts that we can talk about. So to us, the whole of everything becomes unreal. Whereas the fragmented aspect of reality, the reality of parts of categories that the mind creates, becomes real, even though it's unreal, because it's only a convenient fiction. It's only a way of looking at things to suit our uses that we want to put things to. So very oddly, what is real becomes unreal, and what is unreal becomes, and what is real becomes unreal. If I have that the right way around. And the very, very small is easy for us to ignore because we don't have the wherewithal to perceive it anyway. It's our senses don't focus down that far, so it's very easy to ignore the realm of the very, very small. And having said this, as people have said, when it really comes down to it, the world of the very, very small, where measurement breaks down entirely, because when you get smaller than a certain distance, so Planck's length, there's no measurement, so you're in a world which can't be measured. So you can't say it's very small, because there's nothing to compare it with to say it's small. So it's, as Jung says, somewhere bigger than big and smaller than small, and they're both the same thing. So when you go right down below Planck's distance, you get to a realm in which there are no metrics, because there's no comparisons. There's no big and there's no small, there's no up and there's no down. And that's the state which is known as the state of original symmetry. And when you get on the very big, on top of things, and you get to the very big, you've gone out of the realm of metrics again, as I said. So we can see that the world that we know about and feel confident about is really sandwiched between two rabbit holes, the rabbit hole of the very big, the rabbit hole of the very small, and both of these rabbit holes are the same rabbit hole. So it's kind of cocky the way we go around the place thinking, well, the rabbit holes don't exist. There are no rabbit holes. Everything is just a non-rabbit hole. And that's exactly what we do in everyday life. We go around thinking this is a non-rabbit hole situation. There are no rabbit holes. When everything's a rabbit hole, because the thing that we think isn't a rabbit hole actually is the rabbit hole. We just don't see it. So that's just a kind of a preamble to show how ridiculous our situation is. And it certainly is sublimely ridiculous. It couldn't be more ridiculous. All we have to do is to go through those steps of thinking about it or looking at it, and we see, yes, our situation is sublimely ridiculous. And once we have gotten through those steps of enumerating, talking about the very, very big and the very, very small, and how actually once you fall out of the bottom of the known world, you're right up at the top again. Once you've gone through all that, you can see that this presumption that we're making, that the interior world is not a rabbit hole, how outrageous that is, really. It's not just that, oh, we got it wrong. Oh, we made a wrong assumption. It's not just that. It's outrageous. It is totally outrageous. We're denying the biggest thing that there is, which is reality. So nothing ever gets bigger than that, more outrageous than that. Nothing gets more outrageous than denying reality itself and exalting illusions in its place, and then thinking well of ourselves or confident of ourselves and sure of ourselves on that basis. So this is pertinent when it comes to psychology, because psychology then exemplifies our attitude in all things, how we want to belittle reality and make it boring and explainable, and how we want to belittle ourselves, human beings, the psyche, and make it boring, just like him. just like if you read the list of ingredients in a cake mix, or you read a list of side effects on a medication, or that kind of dead, lifeless, bureaucratic thing. So psychology, as it stands, is our way of trying to make a dull, lifeless bureaucracy out of the psyche. Why would we want to do that? It's interesting because we get drawn, most of us would get drawn to studying psychology because we think, we know on some level that the psyche is full of wonders and that it's a portal to a bigger universe, not just a bigger universe, but a whole world that we can't even imagine. And that's a really great human motivation. We want to go down that rabbit hole. And when we go to sign up on some course, we're bamboozled with bullshit. And they spend their whole time trying to prove to us that there is no rabbit hole by pouring out loads of opaque rationality, covering everything over with this obfuscation of rationality, which intimidates us, and we try hard to understand it, and we have to try so hard to understand it that we can't actually see that it's all bullshit, pure bullshit. And it has to be bullshit, because the only thing that isn't bullshit is the rabbit hole. And that's the one thing that modern rational psychology denies. Okay, thanks for watching.